The 7 greatest battles of Alexander the Great. When Alexander III of Macedon ascends to the throne in 336 BC, at just 20 years old, many view him with a mix of distrust and expectation. The son of Philip II, one of the greatest military organizers in Greek history, Alexander inherits a turbulent kingdom, pressured from the outside and restless within. But what no one imagined was that this young man of fiery temperament would surpass all of his father's ambitions, launching himself into a series of military campaigns that would change the course of the ancient world. To understand the true depth of his conquests, it is essential to closely follow his main battles. Each one is marked by boldness, strategic precision, and an almost intuitive ability to seize the decisive moment. The campaign against Thebes. The birth of a commander. Alexander's first great battle does not take place against foreign powers, but within Greece itself. When Philip II dies, some city-states see an opportunity to free themselves from Macedonian dominance, and Thebes is the boldest among them. Learning that Alexander is far away, fighting in the north against Balkan tribes, the Thebans rise in revolt. They believe rumors that the young king has been killed and conclude that a weakened Macedon will not respond. They were wrong. In a lightning march that takes everyone by surprise, Alexander crosses mountainous terrain and in record time, arrives before the walls of Thebes. The Thebans suddenly find themselves face to face with an army they believed no longer existed, and to complete the shock, with a general whose energy strikes like lightning. Alexander surrounds the city and offers amnesty if the leaders of the rebellion are handed over. Thebes refuses. He then orders the attack. The battle is fierce. Led by the phalanx and the companion cavalry, the walls of Thebes are breached and the city is swept in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. The result is devastating. Thebes is destroyed, its inhabitants enslaved, and its territory divided. The message to all of Greece is clear: Macedon remains strong, and Alexander is a capable and merciless king. With that, all of Greece is stabilized under his command, clearing the way for his greater ambition, the conquest of the Persian Empire. The Battle of the Granicus River. The first step into Asia. 1 year later, Alexander crosses from Greece into Asia, with hundreds of ships loaded with troops and war supplies. The goal is to carry out his father's plan, to invade Persia. In Asia Minor, he encounters his first significant resistance: the Persian satraps. Regional governors, they gather contingents of cavalry and Greek mercenary infantry, and position themselves along the banks of the Granicus River, to block the Macedonian advance. The terrain is difficult, the river is deep and its banks are steep, an ideal defensive position. Alexander's generals call for caution. They say that attacking immediately is an unnecessary risk. But the young king, driven by boldness, decides to cross the river that very afternoon. Mounted on his horse Bucephalus, he personally leads the first wave of the attack. The crossing is difficult, with the Macedonians fighting both the current and the Persian cavalry, which strikes them from the top of the riverbank. Even so, the violence of the assault breaks the enemy line. In the midst of the chaos, they almost kill Alexander, saved at the last moment by Clytus the Black, who cuts off the arm of the Persian who is about to strike the king. With the Persian cavalry in retreat, the phalanx crosses the river and pushes the rest of the enemy army back. The result is more political than tactical. The Greek cities of Asia Minor, previously under Persian rule, open their gates to the Macedonian liberator. It is only the beginning, but the psychological impact is immense. The Battle of Issus. Alexander against Darius. The next battle places Alexander directly face-to-face with the great king of Persia, Darius III. With a vast army, Darius seeks to encircle the Macedonian invader. Alexander and his men are to the south on the Syrian coast, when they receive news that the Persians have maneuvered northward, and are already at their rear. The clash will be inevitable. The battlefield is narrow, limited by mountains on one side and by the sea on the other. This limitation cancels out Darius's greatest advantage, numerical superiority. The Persian king positions his Greek mercenaries and the royal guard in the center, while the rest of the army is compressed on the flanks, with no room to maneuver. Darius remains in an ornate war chariot, symbolizing Persian majesty. Alexander, on the other hand, divides his cavalry in two, placing Parmenion on the left to contain the Persian wing, while he attacks on the right with the companion cavalry. When the battle begins, Parmenion faces enormous pressure, but holds his position. At the same time, Alexander advances along the right wing with fierce discipline, attacking the weak point of the Persian line. At a certain moment, when he finds the opening he is looking for, Alexander orders a direct attack on the enemy center. The companion cavalry charges against Darius himself. The Persian king, frightened by the closeness of the Macedonians, flees the battlefield. His retreat triggers a collapse of morale in his army. The victory belongs to Alexander. A few days after the battle, Macedonian troops reach the abandoned Persian camp, where they find the family of King Darius, in addition to an enormous treasure. The treasure is seized to finance the war campaign. But the royal family is treated with dignity, which demonstrates the nobility and character of Alexander, who presents himself to the Eastern world as a civilized king, worthy and deserving of respect. The Battle of Tyre. Conquering the impossible. After the victory at the Battle of Issus, Alexander marches south, toward Egypt. In his path, an obstacle, the Phoenician city of Tyre. Built on a fortified island, famous for its naval fleet and its enormous seafront walls. Tyre is one of the most powerful and long-lasting city-states in the region, resisting various attacks and sieges for more than 20 centuries. The distance between the coast and the island is a natural protection impossible to overcome. But Alexander does not believe in the impossible. Facing the city, he decides to build a huge bridge of stone and wood, advancing over the sea. The Tyrians, incredulous at what they see, decide to counterattack, sending fire ships. For months, they launch continuous attacks against Alexander's workers. Every advance of the Macedonians is met with death and violence. When the bridge finally reaches the city wall, Alexander brings up his siege weapons, including mobile towers 50 meters high. The final attack is devastating. The soldiers climb the walls, invade the city, and take Tyre after one of the most impressive sieges of antiquity. The achievement is both military and symbolic. With incredible determination and majestic strategy, Alexander conquers the impossible. Now the path to Egypt is free, and the Mediterranean world begins to see Alexander's greatness. The Battle of Gaugamela. The fall of the Persian Empire. Of all the battles in Alexander's life, Gaugamela is the most famous. There, before the largest army Darius III ever managed to assemble in a single battle, the Macedonian will face his final test. The Persian king carefully chooses the battlefield, ordering the ground to be leveled months before the confrontation. The Persians know that securing a vast and flat field will give advantages to their blade chariots and will allow the maneuver of their enormous cavalry. Another advantage for Darius is the numerical difference. While Alexander has fewer than 50,000 men, the Persian army numbers more than 150,000 fighters. Curiously, on the night before the battle, Alexander sleeps deeply, while Darius remains restless. This psychological difference well represents the spirit of the two generals at the decisive moment. When the battle begins, Alexander quickly advances diagonally along the right wing, extending his formation. Darius, believing that Alexander is trying to outflank his army, opens his lines to envelop the Macedonian cavalry. That is exactly what Alexander wanted. This movement opens a gap in the Persian line, which Alexander skillfully exploits, charging directly toward the enemy center and aiming at Darius himself. The sight of Alexander advancing toward his position causes panic in the Persian king, who, just as at the Battle of Issus, retreats to avoid encirclement. Once again, Darius's withdrawal causes the Persian army to collapse, without command and without morale. The victory at Gaugamela means the end of the Persian Empire. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis fall one after another, and Alexander becomes king of Asia. The capture of the Sogdian rock. The Macedonians grew wings. After defeating Darius III, Alexander advanced into Bactria and Sogdiana, mountainous and rebellious regions. There he faced guerrilla forces led by local nobles, especially Spitamines and other Sogdian lords. One of the rebel leaders took refuge with his army in a massive fortified rock formation called the Sogdian Rock. The defenders mocked Alexander, saying they would only surrender on the day the Macedonians grew wings. So Alexander did the unexpected. He recruited about 300 climbers to scale the rock during the night. Using iron stakes and ropes, one group managed to reach the highest point of the rock, above the rebels' fortress. At dawn, Alexander's soldiers appeared visibly at the top of the cliff, brandishing their weapons and holding their shields aloft. Then Alexander sent a messenger with the following message: "Look, the Macedonians have grown wings." The Sogdians' morale collapsed. Incredulous at what they saw, they chose to surrender without a fight. Going down in history as one of the most famous episodes of psychological warfare, the capture of the Sogdian Rock shows Alexander's ability to win not only through military force, but also through intelligence and boldness. The Battle of the Hydaspes. The confrontation with King Porus. The last great confrontation of Alexander's career takes place on the banks of the Hydaspes River, in India. There he would face King Porus, a local ruler who commands a formidable army, including about 200 war elephants, animals the Macedonians had never faced before. The Hydaspes River is deep, and Porus guards the bank with constant vigilance. Alexander realizes that a direct crossing would be suicide, so he devises a strategy. During the day, he pretends to make repeated crossing attempts, moving his army to confuse Porus. But at night, while part of the army keeps campfires burning to show presence in the camp, Alexander leads a detachment upstream. In the midst of a storm, which masks the noise of the troops, the Macedonians cross the Hydaspes in secret. When the sun rises, Porus's troops realize that Alexander is already on the other side of the river. The battle begins with violence. The Macedonian cavalry and Porus's army clash. The elephants advance, breaking formations and causing panic. The Macedonian phalanx suffers as never before. However, Alexander uses his mobility to attack the Indian flanks, isolating the infantry and trapping the elephants, which end up turning against their own lines. When Porus is finally defeated, Alexander is impressed by his courage and asks how he wishes to be treated. Promptly Porus says, "Treat me as one king should treat another king." And Alexander replies, "Yes, this I grant you." Thus, Porus was allowed to continue ruling his own territory, being integrated as a province into Alexander's empire. This gesture reflects Alexander's new role, no longer a foreign conqueror, but a king of kings, building a multicultural empire. The Melancholy End of Alexander. After the victory at the Hydaspes, Alexander's soldiers are proud, but also exhausted. They have marched for more than a decade, crossing mountains and deserts, defeating all kinds of enemies, and expanding the empire farther than they had ever imagined. But Alexander, who has the soul of a conqueror and lives for battle, wants to continue eastward. This time, his army refuses the journey. It is the only time Alexander hears a no, and so they return toward the west. Arriving in Babylon, Alexander is very weakened. It is not known whether from the physical strain of the journey, or from the melancholy of a warrior without war. In 323 BC, at 32 years old, Alexander falls ill and dies. His death ends the most extraordinary military career of antiquity.